Okay, thanks very much, Vijaya, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be back here. Much appreciated. We'll try and do the discussion part in about 30 minutes, because I think there's some really meaty topics here, and it'd be great to get a bit of dialogue going between our panelists and you guys as well, and ladies, beg your pardon. To kick off, I'll just make an observation myself and then throw things out to the group here. We're going to talk about IP, cloud, microservices, AI, blockchain. And these are all very new things to media in some respects, although you can argue cloud's been around a long time. And there's been, well, we were talking before we came up about sometimes the perceived conflict between the IT world and broadcast, and that somehow broadcast engineering is a dying art or a dying breed. And it struck me that ever since television started in the early 1930s in Alexandra Palace in London, the broadcast and media industry has always taken the best of technologies that were available at that time and implemented them to bring compelling content to consumers. And that's what was happening in the 1930s, and it's happening today. When I started in broadcasting I'm going to date myself now, in the late 1970s, there were all sorts of people there, essential people around. There were film projections, there were fitter-turners, there were electromechanical engineers. We even had plumbers on staff, because transmitters at the time were largely water-cooled. And then we go into the 80s, and microprocessors starting to find their way, first of all, into VTRs and then into other controls, and then we went digital. And we've always adopted and used the best of technology. So I don't see the newer implementations of things like blockchain or microservices or whatever, or the so-called takeover of IT, by IT of broadcast. I see that just as all part of a journey, as a continuum. And I see what we're going to talk about today as just the next steps in that journey. So let's launch into some of the more meaty topics. If we start with IP and SDN, about 2 years ago, we were promised a revolution, that everything was going to go IP, that this was going to completely change our lives. And I just asked the group here, who of you are using IP, and what sort of, Manesh, I'll start with you. Has it changed your life?
Yes, IP actually has changed the life, the way we broadcast, the way we do business. It has made broadcast far more agile, I would say, and far more flexible to the way business needs the things to be implemented. And I'll be surprised if people have not shifted in this part of the world to IP to a very large extent. And the way we have to go on the digital platforms, the way we have to deliver content on the digital platform, we need to be on IP. And yes, the infrastructure needs to be built accordingly, and investments have to be made in it on a regular basis.
Peter, you and I would probably be the two maybe old-fashioned broadcasters on this panel.
Dinosaurs? Yeah, IP changes, will change our life, and will rapidly step in. For the last few years, they say it's going to happen now. I think now is the moment that also in the traditional broadcast will be, the IP will be much more implemented. Second part is the IP and the connectivity and the platforms and the clouds. It will be for sure a part where we need to move in over the next few years. How fast it will go, it will depend on management decisions, it depends on investments, and on change of investments.
Mm-hmm. Adrian, do you have a view? I'm sure you do.
Well, I mean, I told you guys before we started this that this is probably the topic I know the least about, and to me this is a very traditional broadcast kind of question. I'm completely on the digital side of things, so if you ask me about the importance of IP, I sort of go, well, we wouldn't have any business without TCP IP, and you're probably talking about moving from IP to UDP, right? And SDN, yes, I've vaguely heard about this, but it doesn't really figure that much in my world. mostly very intrigued by the fact that in our technical operations, we have the sort of the broadcast IT side and the digital side, and the technologies have a lot of overlap, but it's also a completely different world at times, and it can be very hard to communicate between the two and understand, it's like, what kind of protocol are you talking about? And it's all very technical in a slightly different way, ranging to a very different way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because there's this part as well where in the IP world, if a packet doesn't arrive, you can always send it again. And I can just tell another very quick story. It goes back to the 1990s when I was working for a company that were involved with Microsoft, one of Microsoft's very early forays into media. And a very senior Microsoft individual, extremely senior, I shouldn't say who he was, but we were having a conversation, and he said, do you think consumers will be happy to have a small window with full frame, 30 frames a second, this was in the States, 30 frames a second, full motion video, or would they prefer a full screen, full raster at perhaps a reduced frame rate? And I said, well, Steve, sorry, the consumers are used to, today, are used to 30 frames a second on a full screen. Oh, he said, is that 30 frames a second every second? So therein lies the difficulty sometimes that you allude to between people who are very much over on the IT side and the broadcast side. But then on the broadcast side, we put the barriers up to say, well, you guys don't understand what we're talking about. But of course, Steve's comment about 30 frames a second every second, within a few very short years, we'd stopped broadcasting 30 frames every second. We broadcast a few frames every second, and then the intermediate frames were exactly that. They were difference information. And before we leave IP, just wanted one further question. And I don't think I've visited a lot of media companies and broadcasters. I don't think I've seen a single one that's fully IP enabled from end to end. A lot on the distribution side, but on the contribution side, less so. Do you think that there's an issue with vendors not giving you the right product, so there's a gap in between your expectations of what vendors are delivering?
See, let's break IP, the whole process, into two. One would be the storage, one is the production and the storage part of it. And the second would be the broadcast part of it. And the way it goes today, yes, there are two different types of vendors here who handle the situation. One would be doing an online play out for you. So yes, there are vendors today who deliver that kind of services to you, and it works perfectly fine with IP deliveries as well. That is the advantage that the broadcasters like us can see with IP. Mm-hmm. And of course, the storage, the moment you have all your content now in files format, it's one of the best things that can happen and allows you a lot of flexibility to do business and different types of businesses that you can do with that content. Okay. So I would say, yeah, it's a next step.
Okay, thank you. In the interest of time, we'll move on to cloud. And I'm waiting to find that my toaster, my next toaster will come with a badge to say it's cloud enabled, because everything seems to be cloud enabled. By a fountain pen, and it's cloud enabled. What does it mean? How do you think cloud is delivering across the entire media value chain? So, Adrian.
Well, again, my perspective, of course, coming from a pure digital background, is pretty much. I can tell you that somewhere in 2002, I was running an online infrastructure on actual servers in our building, and it was a full server room with all of the fixtures that you'd expect, like the fire extinguishing stuff and power backups, etc. And the servers had multiple power supplies, so that if one of the power supplies would fail, the other one would take over, and everything was redundant and fail-safe. And then one of the power supplies actually failed, caught fire, set the top one on fire, so that machine was out. That set the server above it on fire, and that set off the fire extinguisher, which took out the rest of the servers. This was the moment that I vowed never to run my own servers on-premise again. It took us about 3 weeks to recover from this. We moved everything to a hosting company, and I really do not want to see physical machines. Of course, then you get into a broadcast company, And you start realizing it's like, well, this is maybe a little bit too black and white, because we have this entire building, we have studios, there's cameras, there's editing going on, and so on. So, all right, I can understand that we have server rooms and that we have a lot of hardware in our building. And then the problem really becomes, where do you put the cutoff? And a lot of things are relatively easy to move to cloud. So if you're talking about a lot of the office and automation stuff, SharePoint or databases, etc., are relatively easy on a technical level to move into cloud. If you're talking about video, just the amounts of data that this involves and the kind of connectivity you need between your actual building and people working with the video and cloud services to run them is a huge problem, and it's very costly still. So cloud has large efficiencies for a lot of regular old school services. It has a lot of advantages for online services. The problem really is in between, and the problem in between is moving all of this video into your cloud services. And even if you try this like we do, if you only try to do this for a VOD service to play video to your consumers, you're not even talking about taking your entire library and all of your editing into cloud. It's still huge amounts of data. Mm-hmm. And we're constantly struggling with that cutoff point and where does it go from our asset management system, and where do we actually upload this into our cloud services. Mm-hmm. So bandwidth is a huge challenge in that, especially when it concerns video. Cost of processing in cloud is still a huge issue as well. Mm-hmm. So even though I don't want to run servers, I've had to acknowledge in the past few years that there were a couple of cases where I had to admit, it's like, well, yes, okay, this is a good example of where it still makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, and that seems to be a common trend, doesn't it? That the two things that mitigate against larger media companies in general fully embracing cloud is connectivity, bandwidth. And the associated cost and hosting costs, but also security. And Manesh or Peter, what have you come across in your experience around those two areas, particularly around security, security of content, both when it's at rest and in transit?
We have far more acceptance towards cloud now, and I think most of the broadcasters do have acceptance towards cloud in terms of what kind of content to store. There are times when you might not store the full res. It's like uploading a hard HD file on a cloud would be an issue, but when you transcode it to the kind of formats that you want, it might be easier. But having said that, cloud does benefit broadcasters like us. Faster implementation, scalability, it does. And there is an acceptance now when you talk to business about keeping the content on the cloud as well, which you're not storing in the actual format that it was created in. It's been transcoded to the level that you need, and then you paste it up. And yes, it does work to your advantage.
You've actually hit on one of the biggest advantages of cloud is that scalability. That as a customer, and I've spent many years as a customer, you can build to the steady state, not having to do what we currently do and build to the peaks.
Yeah, another advantage is you can use cloud to do remote kind of work on your content as well, which means I have a content created here locally, but if I want in India somebody to look at it, or anywhere else in the world to look at it and do some process on it, I can do that. So using skills that are dependent on that are connected to each of the country, I can work, and that's how we do for our platforms as well, for our digital platforms as well, and it makes our life much more simpler.
Can I?
Yep.
On the topic of security. Having been sort of an early adopter of cloud, I've run into that argument a lot. There's a lot of people who sort of are afraid that putting stuff out there through the internet, etc., is going to be incredibly unsafe, and it's sort of scary and intangible. But if you're looking at actual security, then it's physical security and then the actual virtual security. Physical security, my stance has been for a long time that a company that runs hosting or cloud or servers as their only business will be much better at this than any company with an IT department will ever be. Amazon servers, Microsoft servers, if you can find their data center, if you can get into their data center. If you manage to then find the server where that particular stuff would be running on, you've passed so many hurdles, and especially Microsoft is very proud of the number of certifications they have on security, which are almost impossible for any company here to achieve. So physical security and the power backups, etc., that they have is very, very hard to get anywhere close to that. Virtual security, I think nowadays that's the intangible part as well. To me, there isn't really that much difference between your company network and your cloud network. You have to secure this. You have to put in place the proper configurations and firewalls, etc. It's something that, for instance, on Amazon, by default, you have to start opening up things bit by bit. What you want to allow to be open to the public, what you want to allow to be open to your network. That part is nowadays almost completely the same, whether it's your office network or a cloud service, with the main difference being that, again, there's a lot more experience and standard default settings on cloud that make this a lot easier to secure. Mm-hmm. So my point of view is that, yes, I know how counterintuitive this is to many people. You can't see the server, you don't know where it's at. You sort of feel like, I know it's in this rack and there's a lock on it, and I know there's one cable coming out and I know it goes through a firewall. It sort of appears more secure, but to me, cloud is many times more secure on multiple levels.
Mm-hmm. Peter.
Yeah, I understand that. Security is one of the main points beside bandwidth and the amount of storage you need in some cases. But if, for instance, we want to move our playout into a cloud environment, we need to be very sure about all these things. Now we can bring our playout and make it an isolated bubble and not even connect him to wherever in the world and make him as his own piece. Where we're going to move him tomorrow into the cloud. What I think are advantages, because as you say, the power supply goes down, the second one goes up, and it's gone. Where in the cloud we will not have this problem. The problems are different, I believe, in the cloud than in a standard environment in your premise. But security is still a topic that a lot of people need to be convinced about. A lot of people need to be ensured that it's like that. I can't imagine that one of our channels gets hacked and gets the incorrect information on. So we need to. The main thing I believe is in the broadcast world, and especially when you come out of the long-term broadcasters like for instance, an Abu Dhabi Media, is convinced management that the way forward is also a secured way forward, because until now it worked like this, so why should we go to the next level? Yeah. And they understand the advantage, but we are, as technology people, need to tell them that they can be sure about this and what the advantage is.
Mm-hmm. So the other three topics that we have on our list here all sort of segue out of and also become part of a cloud conversation. As you look at microservices and how we would use microservices in a cloud environment, artificial intelligence or machine learning, that, again, like cloud itself, that means an awful lot of things to an awful lot of different people. And then finally, and arguably, what may become one of the biggest game changers in our industry in the coming years is blockchain. And blockchain's been around for nearly 10 years, but it's only recently that the applications of blockchain in a media world have begun to be explored, and indeed the applications outside cryptocurrencies. And rather than taking each of those individually and in the interests of time, maybe we can consider all three together. And I'm keen to have a quick conversation about blockchain and then how that will be enabled, and whether there's a role for AI and machine learning, and whether potentially that could be a detractor from it. Adrian, I'll go to you first again.
What I love about AI and machine learning is that this year I think it's probably the biggest buzzword in IT there is. I more or less keep track quarter to quarter what the big buzzword is that everybody's talking about. In general, buzzwords imply that people generally don't really know what they mean or what they're talking about. And that's a problem, and it greatly annoys me. Even if I talk about something that I don't know anything about, It still annoys me if people just throw it around as a term. AI and machine learning right now, I think we've reached peak AI. Any software you run right now is now coming up with AI in some way or another. And the issue there is that people don't really know the difference between AI and machine learning. And actually a friend of mine who is in the startup community said that the difference between AI and machine learning is that you call it AI when you're trying to get investors because it sounds cool, and you call it machine learning to your developers. So sarcasm aside, I think there's a lot of employ, of course, for AI. So it's actually almost to the point that it's such a broad thing. We could sit here for hours talking about the applications of AI in broadcast, which range from the various services you see with the Microsofts and Googles, etc. of this world, analyzing video, analyzing it for sentiment, translating text in it, automatic captioning, but also finding scenes, finding thumbnails, and so on. So there's an increased use of processing which is really fueled by AI and largely by just training software on what it is you're looking for, trying to recognize faces in video and so on. And there's a lot of very exciting services there, and especially because they're now starting to get commoditized, so we can actually just go to one of these large companies and say, well, we'd like to run a service which recognizes all of the faces in our videos. That's something you can just turn on and run your video against. If you take it out of the context of the companies that have these huge data sets to train it on, it becomes a bit more problematic. So if you think you can set up your own AI and train it with your own data, then usually where this breaks down is, well, actually you don't have that much data compared to a Google or an Amazon. So it will always be a very disappointing result that you get out of it.
Thanks, Peter. Peter?
AI?
Yeah. Oh, AI, blockchain, microservices. When you talk about AI, you see the potential. Adrian, you mentioned being able to deploy AI as commodities, which should potentially run as microservices on some Azure or AWS platform. In your experience, how important is it today? How important do you see it becoming in the future?
The AI for sure is something that we in the broadcast would use in the news and all these areas, also in our libraries, that we can much faster look at things, and while we digitalize, we can add this metadata what the search will make much faster. So it's a very important part for the future, and it's implemented by a lot of companies now, media companies, that gives you the ability to use it. Yeah.
Yeah, I know in my own company we're leaning very heavily into providing, and again, it's as much machine learning as it is AI, but particularly in man products, and I know others in the same, doing an advertisement for Avid. There are others who are doing similar. We're not the only ones who are doing it. Manesh?
For AI, you need a large data sets. And again, that creates an infrastructure that creates, that you need to create the intelligence in the software, and it's done over a period of time. With us, we are learning this process, or we are getting into this process with our OTT platform as well now, and we would be looking at our options, how we can do it in-house, or we can outsource it as one of the options that we can look at.
And before we throw it out to the audience, just
you still wanted to get to blockchain.
I do want to get to blockchain. I do, absolutely, because again, it's a buzzword. Everybody's throwing the word blockchain around. A year ago, apart from the fact that I knew that there was something called blockchain which underpinned Bitcoin, I had absolutely no idea what it was, how it worked, and and if somebody had said to me, there's some great implications here for the media industry, I would have scratched my head and thought, now, different.
On a less technical part, I'm more look at things, how can we use it in the media industry. And this morning I was listening to the first panel where they said we need writers, we need more writers to make more content, and good writers. I believe there are a lot of good writers in the world. if the Bitcoin, as far as I understand it, can be there, a point where these people can be the start of something, where everybody can pick it up, and it can be monitored by the previous person, and you can see an evolution, you can see it moving around. So it can be, and there can be a monetizing in and a security in also, because somebody knows exactly what's happening with his or her content, for instance, with this writing, with this script. Was it added? Was it adjusted? Was it? So there I see a way forward in using it.
I mean, that's exactly a year ago. That's where I first saw it, and I scratched my head and think, what are you talking about? And it wasn't in video; it was audio. The Pro Tools community collaborate hugely across the cloud. So somebody in LA will work with somebody in London. They may want a particular guitar part that say they want to work with a guy on a guitar part, and then it gets transferred back. But then how do you protect that, and how do you then ensure that the correct payment is made for that? And there's a couple of guys, I mean, there's a number of people doing this now, working through on using blockchain to create a collaboration and monetization methodology within the Pro Tools community, so that this just becomes automatic. And then if that guitar part goes into this track, which then gets played, becomes a mega hit, that every time it's played, the guitar player gets his royalty or her royalty automatically and instantaneously, rather than this massive system where you're going through performing rights organizations and you've got many, many people in the middle.
I would just like to clarify one thing, that Bitcoin and blockchain are two different things, two different layers. Bitcoin is using the blockchain as an infrastructure to be used, and till now we've not heard about hacking in Bitcoin. So having said that, the way the architecture is made, yes, it does take us to a next level which says that, yes, can content be stored? Can it be shared? Can it be broken down into and stored in that manner? Yes, it can be. It looks very positive right now. So yes, I would put my bet on this subject, and I'm sure there are a lot of coders or developers who are actually working on this angle to take it to the next level for broadcast as well.
And Adrian, let's ask you the question. Is part of taking your Bitcoin point, part of the reason I think why Bitcoin hasn't been hacked is the scale and the resources and the computing power that would be necessary to go right down through all these blocks, hack one, and then build it all back up again. So is the inherent security of blockchain not a matter of scale, just purely scale, or is it something else? I mean, if I have a, say, private blockchain that I'm running within my own organization, does that then just not become another database that somebody can get in and hack?
Yeah, no, and I think my pet peeve again on this is that if I would now ask is that if there's anybody in this room who can explain blockchain in 5 sentences or less, please raise your hand. Nobody. And
I'm not raising mine.
Or maybe just afraid to be called out on it, but that's a problem because it's a very technical subject. And again, a lot of people are talking about this, and then mostly sort of talking about Bitcoin, which is just an application of the principle. It really is about a distributed ledger of keeping transactions, which also means that if you want to do this within your company, it sort of doesn't make any sense because that's the same thing as having a cluster of one computer. That's just not how it works. One of the applications I do really see a future for in this, and I think you refer to this already as well, is it could very well be the future of DRM. Currently, DRM in digital is very much based on centralized servers that give a yes or no authorization against somebody wanting to play a video stream. That means that you're always stuck with the app that actually is connected to this DRM server, releasing keys for you to play this video, which checks if you have a subscription, etc. If you want to move away from having those very isolated silos of content and have much more of a sense of, like a TV, you turn on your TV, you have multiple channels. We don't really have a digital equivalent of this right now. If you would build a DRM based on transactions and distributed ledgers and using the encryption to safeguard all of this, you could actually turn this into, well, it doesn't really matter what you use to play this video. It could be some small app that a 15-year-old guy in the UK built, or it could be the official app for one of the large broadcasters, because the transaction per view and per use of the video is actually kept in a blockchain. So that would be a very exciting application of it in media, I think.
One final question before we throw it out to the audience, and maybe somebody in the audience would answer this as well. Do you think that there's, if you look at the way Bitcoin has used blockchain to disaggregate central banks and commercial banks, do you think that in the same way the media applications of blockchain could disaggregate traditional broadcasters, even traditional OTT organizations? Are we going to see Netflix being disaggregated?
Imagine Netflix suddenly giving you an app and saying, I have also decided to use blockchain as a way of distributing content. Mm-hmm. And that will be happening soon. It's a matter of time how soon that happens as well. And it's a matter of point whether they get into the boat or they just leave it away. I mean, you just ignore it. Mm-hmm. But I think if you do that, yes, it does. I think that those steps are closer because the transaction payments, it just points towards that right now.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Adrian and Manish and Peter. We've got about 10 minutes left, I think, and I'd like to give the audience an opportunity to ask any of these three fine gentlemen any questions that they might want to throw at us, or myself as well, and if I can, in my own imperfect way. Any questions?
Coming up.
Mark Barkey's got to have at least one.
When you asked, hi, my name is Aryan, I'm with OSN. When you asked, raise your hand if you know anything about blockchain, I was tempted, but I probably couldn't stand your a follow-up question if there were any. But the topic we talked about in the previous panel, piracy, isn't blockchain a direct help, if you will, to limit, if not finish, piracy? Can you explain?
I didn't quite hear that.
So, the volume is a little bit low here. Are you asking, does blockchain help to limit piracy?
Yes.
Could be, I believe. It's one of the reasons why it could be used. Where other people say, start to use, for instance, the watermarks and all these things, yeah. It will probably reduce, and it will give you the possibility to see who is doing what much more. But are we going to stop it with the blockchain? I'm not sure about that. Mm-hmm. Will it change the future of broadcasting? I believe much more there that it will happen. Yeah.
I'm going to be simplistic now and ask, would it still not just be possible to strip out the essence of the content anyway and stick it on a BitTorrent site? Just before lunch we were talking about BitTorrents, and of course some applications are legal, some are illegal, but there's been many ways of circumventing many encryption systems. Would this just not be another way of doing it? Or rather, would stripping out the essence not be another way of circumventing it?
Yeah, so the core problem, of course, is always going to be that if you display it, you've already decrypted and opened it up, and you can have DRM or blockchain or whatever on this. But that's the point that at the end of the day, somebody can put a camera in front of a screen and just tape it. Mm-hmm. What's going to, in digital at least, I'm convinced, is going to save us mostly from piracy is not trying to lock down on the technical level as much as possible, because that becomes an impossible thing to chase. There's no absolute security there. So we really do have to work on mostly convenience and quality as an edge over pirated content. because in practice people do tend to gravitate, even if they have to pay for a service, if it has high quality without accidentally having burnt in Spanish subtitles or audio that cuts out every once in a while, or you're missing the last 3 minutes of your movie. And it's a service where you can just have the convenience and click through it and find your content. That's going to probably win out over a lot of pirated content. I think mostly blockchain in this context means that there could be many more distribution platforms for content than just a single app. And in that sense, indirectly, it could avoid piracy.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Any other questions on any of the topics we've discussed? IP, cloud, microservices? Yeah.
Pete, since you're
Mo.
the fountain of all knowledge, what is blockchain? Because a lot of people here that I'm pretty sure don't understand, me for one.
Well, I'll attempt to give an answer to that. I'll give it a go. What's blockchain? It's a block of chains. Okay, great. So what's so unique about a chain of blocks? Each block represents a transaction. And Adrian, you jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, because you guys are far cleverer than I am. Each block represents a transaction. And then each transaction follows another to create a chain. What the important part of it is, two important parts. One is the interface between one block and the block following it. That is a unique relationship, a unique hashed relationship between the block and the block follows it and the block behind it. The second part of it is the distributed nature of the blockchain itself, that it isn't just stored in one location. Each of these if you like, encrypted interfaces is being created by multiple different people in multiple different parts of the world. And then this chain is replicated and verified on a very frequent basis. I think Bitcoin, it's minutes. And now, the bit that does my head in is how the arbitration works, and maybe somebody else could explain that. But that's the unique part of it. One is the relationship that each block has to the block ahead of it and the block behind it. And the second part is the distributed nature of it. That's the point I made earlier, where if you just had a sort of an on-prem blockchain, could somebody, was that not essentially just a database? Or you could also say, well, blockchain is just a very secure database which is distributed huge around the world with multiple levels of encryption, because each of these interfaces is encrypted. And in order then to hack it, if you want to steal something from it, you have to identify the transaction that you're going to steal. And in order to do that, then you've got to unpick everything that went after it, change that, and then rebuild everything. And if you're dealing with a blockchain that's replicated on many, many different locations worldwide, you've got to do that. It becomes an exponential function. So that's as simple as I can.
Most simplistic would be, say there are 100 computers in this room, and a large file is stored as blocks in each of these computers. And as I go to block 1, or the first computer, the end of that block will tell me it's there on computer 99, the second block. From 99, it might send me to another computer. So this is how, it's a peer-to-peer, if you remember torrents, BitTorrents. This is definitely far more secured environment than BitTorrents. But BitTorrents was peer-to-peer, this also is peer-to-peer. So yeah, that's more simplistic way of explaining.
Any more questions?
At the front, Abu Dhabi.
Hi, Peter. Just a small explanation of blockchain. A blockchain is initiated as a metadata from any transaction, and it will start to build as this transaction is going to grow. So it is a unique, they call it hash. There's a unique hash for each transaction, and it will contain the information. As you grow as a mesh network, let's say it's a mesh network, to do some shake hand of the transaction of the next step. So it's sort of people, they acknowledging the transaction on the network. So nobody's owning this network, is internet owning the network. So sort of distribution, the information or metadata in different location. And just regarding the cloud is basically the servers owned by somebody else. If I want to avoid a power supply burn, I initiate another risk on this network. Especially, for example, example happened here maybe 5-6 years back, when the cable in Suez Channel is being damaged, and that reduced the internet connectivity and the fiber connectivity about 80% of the speed. It was a disaster if we are in a cloud in different geographic area. Cloud is a good solution for small business, but for big business for the time being I think is another risk we added. What we are doing by involving the cloud, we are transferring the risk from the technical team to another party. If my managing, they told me why the channel is off air, I told them it's not my problem, it's a cloud problem. And this is I think why some of the people, they would like to go to cloud in this moment. Until the infrastructures happen, I don't think it's a good solution for everybody.
Thank you. Very good points.
Jump into this.
Yeah, please do.
So first of all, on the blockchain, and a great job at explaining it, or trying to explain it. But my question would now be, does everybody now in this room understand what blockchain is? You were both very correct in your explanations, but the problem is it's not something you describe in 5 sentences and everybody goes, so that's how it works. And that's very relevant if you're talking about the applications, because it's key to what's possible and what is completely ludicrous as a business idea to use blockchain on. As for the cloud and physical security and the reliability of cloud, I think a large part of this is a change in the way of thinking about this. If you use cloud basically as a bunch of virtual services, and you sort of go, I have a machine here, I will just do a virtual instance in Azure or an EC2 instance on Amazon, and that will be the same thing. Then you run into a lot of the sort of beginner's mistakes that, Amazon, for instance, doesn't actually guarantee that these servers will be up. And their point would be that, best practice is you run it in at least 2 availability zones and probably in multiple regions. And if you don't do that, you will have outages. And we see that even large internet companies run into these problems because they ignore this, either because they don't want to pay for it and just take the risk, or because they just badly architect their cloud solutions. So it takes a bit more than just saying, okay, we have this infrastructure here. It would be easier to have it, not have to deal with the hardware and the physics of it, etc. Let's just migrate all of those instances into cloud instances. No, it really takes re-architecting the way you've built up your infrastructure. Because otherwise, yes, you do get outages where you don't have any control over it, and the only thing you can say is like, well, yes, Amazon has a problem. What can we do?
The main thing is, I believe that the new technologies as they are in front of us, or the technologies in IP for pure IP people, they're not new anymore. You're already 2 steps further, or maybe even more than we are. But we need to use new technology and any technology as it fits us, and not because it's around and everybody wants to use it. It needs to be very clear where it fits in your business model, and what you're going to do with it, and what it needs to serve you. Technology needs to serve you, and it needs to add on something. If it doesn't add on, and this is a very important line where you need to say, this is perfect for us, but this service will never work for us. Are we going to put 12 or 14 petabyte in the cloud, or are we going to keep a part on our deep archives? Are we going to monetize everything? Do we need to have everything in a second, or can we wait for a few hours? If I just ask it, can it come up from somewhere? So these are all things that are important. Yeah. Although I think within the next 2-3 years, we are
there are different
very far in
services that are available on the cloud, as I said before, and one of those things is creating a content in place A and getting it post-production done in place B. Again, these services can be used by you. A simple one is an Office 365 that you're using. It's on cloud, and again, it's a simple functionality. You pick up the services that you can make you as a better broadcaster, and I think that's what you need to use out of that. Nobody is definitely saying that move your content on the cloud. That's not the right way. The bandwidth cost doesn't agree to that locally. So you're not going to do that part at all. It's again the features or the services that you can use from there, and that's.
And it's, it is the resilience, the duplication, the resilience versus the cost. I use OneDrive, but I also use Dropbox, and I keep both of them replicated. Adrian, Monish, Peter, we've run out of time. Thank you very much for your contribution, and thank you everybody for the really good questions we had as well. Thank you.